Welcome to today's edition of Tales from a Witch's Hearthfire. Today I'm going to be talking about tradition, what I think constitutes tradition, or what could potentially be defined as tradition. As some of you know, I'm an initiate of the Sacred Pentagraph and Horsa traditions, which belong to a family tree of 3 traditions. Those are the Horsa, Sacred Pentagraph, and Gala traditions. When I think about traditions, I like to use the metaphor of a tree. When you think of a tree, it has deep roots and a trunk and branches. And when I think of our traditions, I think of the roots as the solid foundations of the tradition. When you think of a trunk of a tree, these would typically include things like the religious philosophies, the religious theology. It would include things like tenets, axioms, and ritual structures. While I see our traditions as belonging to the same tree, each of our traditions belongs to a separate branch. Each of these traditions has the opportunity for unique expression within the group and in a comfortable space where these groups can explore their individual mysteries. So the way I view other traditions outside of our own is that they developed from the same tree, but they're not the same tree. They may have little saplings that grew and developed into their own unique structure. So they may be similar to the original tree, but they are not part of the same tree. Of course, please understand that this is just my conception of this. One of the things that I had to do when I first joined my traditions was I had to learn the actual tradition. So aside from the occult topics, what did this mean for me? Well, first it meant that I was to copy the book or the grimoire, or as some of you may refer to it, a book of shadows. I needed to copy that. And then I needed to understand the deep philosophical and religious theology that was the basis of the tradition. There are many other things that go along with tradition, and I thought that I would go through some criteria that I believe would make up a tradition. So as most of you know, my traditions are religious traditions. Now today I don't want to delve too deeply into what constitutes a religious tradition, because as some of you are aware, when you delve into anthropological and religious studies, religion quickly becomes very hazy and murky and sometimes muddled because of the different terminology used within these systems. And even in terms of people themselves who adhere to these practices, they may define themselves differently. So for me, when talking about tradition, and specifically I would say from my perspective as an anthropologist, I like to think of the criteria that is required, or rather what I would consider the minimum criteria required for something to qualify as a tradition. So there are several points that I had jotted down, and I'll just quickly summarize and read those for you. So the first thing would be a tradition needs a cohesive system. And when I'm talking about a tradition, I'm talking specifically about a witchcraft tradition. So it would need firstly a cohesive system. It would need a developed theology. It would also have specific ways of performing spells, or at least some sort of basic recipe that is common in the tradition to perform spells, or some sort of structure and ritual structure for those spells to be performed within. There would also need to be symbolic meaning or special significance with origins of the past. It would have a list of holy days or Sabbaths or special celebrations, and even perhaps list specific days that are good for attending ritual. It would have meaningful clothing, jewelry, and material artifacts. It would have social norms and specific greetings. It would have rules for social interaction. And there would be specific concepts that are practiced within a tradition or within a group. At its core, a tradition would really have some things in common. It would have specific ideas, specific objects, specific beliefs, and specific customs. These would then be passed down generation after generation. Some authors have stated that a tradition is not a tradition until it has been passed down at least 3 times. Now, I am not going to pass a value judgment on the time that is required for tradition. I'm merely going to say, within my concept of tradition, that it is something that is cohesive, that meets these criteria that I've just mentioned, and that is passed down to the next generation. But in general, I think most of us can agree that tradition is something that is transmitted and handed over to a new generation. Sometimes it's commonly assumed that traditions have customs and ancient history that is passed down, but this is not necessarily always the case, because as we know, Wicca itself is a fairly new religion. When you consider Wicca as a religion, it's a fairly new religion, and it was invented on purpose. Wicca borrowed liberally from many other religious and ceremonial type traditions. I found a really great book when I was contemplating traditions by Ed Schill that was written, I believe, in 1981. And he had a specific distinction and definition of what he thought would constitute a tradition. So I'm just going to read that to you. He said, tradition can be defined as the decisive criterion of tradition is that it having been created through human action with thorough thought and imagination, it is handed down from one generation to the next. So I'm just going to repeat that. The decisive criterion is that having been created through human actions, through thought and imagination, and it is handed down from generation to generation. Based on this concept of tradition, that it is handed down through human thought and through imagination, and from one generation to the next, I thought that if we were to unpick the criteria that I had listed previously, that the criteria that I listed would meet the criteria or the definition that Ed Schill had defined. Our traditions of witchcraft, we have a socially cohesive system. A socially cohesive system generally means that you have people who share common beliefs, ideas, values. Within our traditions, we also have material and social artifacts. When you think of material artifacts, you think of tangible objects. So if I was talking in terms of anthropology, I would think of things like pottery or weapons or armor and things to that effect. When we think about material artifacts within our specific tradition, we can think about things, material things like our tools and clothing. Those are material artifacts that have very specific significance and symbology, but that are rooted in deeper philosophical and religious understandings. Those things stand for something else. On their own, they are just tools, but because they have social and religious, in this particular case, religious significance, those would be considered our material artifacts. We then also have social artifacts, or religious artifacts in this case, and what that would mean is that we have specific and common beliefs, ideas, tenets, values. Those are things that might be considered religious or social artifacts. When we think about meaningful clothing and things that relate to material artifacts, you can also think of things like our robes. Within all of our traditions, we have very specific robes that are worn by the specific grades, and we also wear singulums or cords, and each cord has a specific color. Each of those cords also hold very specific significance and rank. When we think about the sacred pentagraph tradition in particular, and those material artifacts are available for you to look up in the Sacred Pentagraph books. But if I were to use an example from that tradition, I would say that one of the material artifacts of becoming a covener would be the book. They would be given the book, and they'd be given a very specific color cord. And those articles are symbolic of becoming a covener. When you think of a high priestess in the Sacred Pentagraph tradition, they will be given a besom. As you can see behind me over there is my besom, and the besom itself has very specific religious and cultural and religious significance within my tradition. So thinking of the besom, I was contemplating the idea of how traditions exist outside of a specific context, and if they can exist outside of a specific context. Because as you might know, the Horsa tradition developed in the New Forest in England. The New Forest being a beautiful forest area just outside of Burley, and that is where Sybil Leek, our ancestor, came from. And her coven, the Horsa coven, practiced in the New Forest. Now, back then in the New Forest, every witch had their own besom, and certain herbs were tied to the besom to clear the ritual area, to clear the ritual circle. So both physically sweeping it clean and perhaps energetically sweeping it clean. Now, when Sybil moved to somewhere like Las Vegas, which is in the middle of a desert in Nevada, there probably aren't any trees available, so it's almost impossible for every witch within that tradition to have their own besom. So the tradition evolved, as traditions, in my opinion, are supposed to do. They're supposed to evolve. But that tradition evolved so that only the high priestess was given a besom. The besom was still used, though the symbolic value of the besom wasn't lost, because the besom was still used to clear the area, whether physically sweeping out the area or energetically sweeping out the area. And there are other various uses that the besom is also used for within the Sacred Pentagraph tradition, but the symbolic and religious concepts underlying the outer symbol, the besom, stayed the same. But it changed in terms of not just using a branch cut down from a tree and having herbs tied to it, but rather to then use perhaps a manufactured besom, or one that was made to be more permanent. I know that culture and society and social norms are not set in stone. They change over time. Nothing is going to remain constant, and I think that witchcraft traditions also need to evolve. They need to change over time. But I would add a bit of a caveat here, and I would say that when a tradition changes or evolves, depending on circumstances, depending on more knowledge and understanding and deeper insight into things, or even social changes that occur, it might be a very good idea to enter into very deep contemplation and have an understanding of why you are changing a tradition, or why you are allowing something to evolve. Because specifically within our traditions, we would probably not change the tradition willy-nilly. It would require us to think about it in great depth, and we would probably have many conversations, and we would meditate quite deeply on why we would change it, and then there would be an agreement of why a tradition or a specific aspect of our tradition would need to change. I would very much like to know what you think. What do you think makes up a tradition? What do you think is required for a tradition to be a tradition? I'm always willing to learn, and I'm really interested to hear what you have to say as well, because Wicca is not dogmatic. The ideas that I've shared with you today are purely my ideas on the topic, so please let me know in the comments below.